All right, welcome everyone. Welcome, Steve. I can see Steve is on. So this talk is going to be very, very fascinating just because I am blessed to have Dr. Heather. And I've known Dr. Heather for 16, maybe 17 years. Actually, Heather used to work with my friend Tom. And back then, Tom and I went to Penn State together, and that was many, many years ago. And so we're fortunate to have Dr. Heather here, and we're going to discuss, essentially, if you look at the topic is like, how is medicine broken, right? And so how this is going to work is I'm going to ask Dr. Heather some questions, and I will also post some things for the participants to interact. I don't want this to be simply us talking at you. I want you guys and girls out there to interact and ask questions. And so during the discussion, you'll see like these things will pop up on the screen, hopefully if technology works, and then you get to kind of chime in and share your thoughts on this, right? So I think the first question that I have is, in what way is medicine broken?
I've got two really good examples.
Okay.
One is the 52-year-old head of the American Heart Association had a heart attack last fall. I think it was last fall. And they knew he was at risk. He was on all of the medications and he lived,
yeah,
but it still happened because those medications aren't treating the cause. And I think that's the big, big place where medicine is broken, because if you don't treat the cause, it's just like cutting a wire to a warning light that's telling you that something is wrong.
Yeah.
And then ignoring it and hoping that the problem will go away. The other big piece, I think, is that based on statistics that were published on like even CBS and that sort of thing, so many people die from medical mistakes that it's the third leading cause of death in the United States.
Yeah, I think most people don't know about that stat for sure.
Right, and that's pretty, and I have a patient who is extremely wealthy. She has her name on a plaque in a wing of a hospital.
Okay.
And she's quite old. And so she was, she had an issue where she had to go into the hospital. One of her caretakers dropped her, and it was a bad scenario. So she gets sent to the wing of the hospital that she has funded, and she got pneumonia. She got a serious infection. They dehydrated her, and she wasn't, given any information or any food or nutrients for 24 hours.
Wow.
And so that's what happens when you own the wing of the hospital. Like, think about what happens when you don't. And you think that customer service would be a little bit better. I mean, it's kind of funny, but it's really not, because it's so overwhelming as far as that emergent care where everything is an emergency and you're just trying to put out fires as fast as possible because prevention isn't done.
Sure.
And I think that's another big piece where the prevention, like the top 10 preventative things that the American Medical Association puts out are tests. That's not prevention, that's early detection.
Yeah, interesting. So yeah, for sure. I feel like I always tell people, like, if you go into a hospital, that's where the most dangerous bugs are, right? Like the worst germs are there.
Right.
And what do you think about, like, just, your friendly neighborhood? You typically go to your family care physician, what I call like what the masses have access to, like that medicine. What do you see in that approach or that system that is in every which way broken?
Well, unfortunately, I think it was in 1992 or the early 90s, a bunch of the health insurance companies got together and they decided that you could bill more for a 15-minute appointment per minute than you could for a 30-minute appointment. So it really shifted pressure to be into shorter appointments, which don't give a whole lot of time to actually, say, hello, Steve, how's your wife? How's the kids? What's going on? How do you feel? And then, by the time you get to, through small talk, if there's any, and there's any like personal connection, which is really missing from a lot of that,
sure.
There's no time to really diagnose. A lot of patients don't even get touched anymore.
Yeah.
They're not even doing physical exams. And there's a lot of really fantastic science around that, but that personalized piece is gone. And then all that's there is like the time to write a prescription. Right. And one of the big issues with that is like ear infections or colds. The cold is a virus. Ear infections in kids are usually, a virus. And so we've been giving antibiotics just automatically for so many years that now we've created superbugs. Yeah. Because, there's this automatic, well, we'll just go to the prescription. And unfortunately, what those prescriptions do, now some of them do treat the cause, right? Like antibiotics, antivirals, like those will treat the cause. They've saved more lives than just about anything else in medicine besides when, a nurse came up with, let's wash our hands, everybody. Right? That's a good plan. And so I'm not discounting that, but most other medications are poisoning enzyme systems that your body has for a reason based on however many, like we're a pretty complex organism and we need enzymes to run. Yeah. And when you poison those enzymes, there's always going to be side effects. There's always going to be side effects. And a lot of times we have something called polypharmacy, where we just have another drug to take care of a side effect from the first drug, and you're never ever expected to get better, really. You're never expected to get better. But I think you and I see people get better all the time. Yeah,
for sure. There's definitely a different approach. So like, what do you think are some of the side effects, right? I feel like a lot of people who go to their traditional physician, and I want to say before I actually finish this question that we're not implying the doctors are bad. It's the system. No. Right? No doctor goes to school and graduates and says, I hope I don't help people. Like, I hope I don't spend enough time with people. Every doctor is caring. It's the system. Yep. So before we proceed, I want to make sure that it's the system, the financially driven, insurance-driven system that is causing a lot of this, for sure. Right. So given that, what do you think is a side effect of the current system that some of the people who may be watching may not realize that there are some side effects onto them as far as the current medical system?
Well, a couple of years ago, because I teach pharmacology, and so I pay a lot of attention to the use of drugs. And one of the accepted side effects of the #1 most prescribed drug in the world, which is the statin drug class for high cholesterol, is diabetes. I mean, that is a side effect. And so nobody wants diabetes. I mean, diabetes results in kidney failure, blindness, amputations, liver failure. And I mean, it makes everything worse, right? Yep. And it means cancers, etc. And so that's one of the side effects is worsening health. I don't think a whole lot of people go on, a medication. Sometimes they do, right? Like they'll go on a medication and they're like, oh, I feel so much better. And those are wins, but they might happen maybe 5 to 3% of the time. A lot of the time it's like, well, my labs are good, but I still don't feel well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for sure. Yeah. Anything else other than definitely like, I feel like definitely the current approach using certain meds, just the side effects of those meds aren't really being fully explained to patients.
No. No, and the commercials are crazy, right? Because the commercials don't even have to disclose all of the side effects, but there's a new diabetes medication that helps the kidneys clear out glucose from the blood. So it's just trying to like increase, like get that glucose out of the blood no matter what. And one of the side effects is genital yeast infections because the yeast are like, whoopee, this is our favorite food. Yeah. So, I mean, then you have another infection that's going to be really problematic in cleaning up. Then you get put on an antifungal. The antifungals can be really hard on the liver. Then you have liver failure. And I feel like in a lot of ways, Steve, you and I are almost like, we're not medical mediums, but we can be like medical fortune tellers in that I can see how people's health is going to progress based on the meds that they're on, because there's some pretty clear side effects that go along with these things that people are given. And unfortunately, we talked about physicians and what they're allowed to do. Like functioning inside this box that's called standard of care. And if they deviate from that standard of care, they're opening themselves up to medical malpractice.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to get lawyers involved, right?
Yeah, for sure. I actually have a great story on this. So last week, a new patient started, and she's here for hip pain, back pain. She walks with a cane, poor balance. She literally is like stumbling all over the place. So during the evaluation, I heard some interesting things. One thing was mentioned was I have a urinary tract infection that just never goes away. I was interesting. And then she said, I tore my Achilles 9 years ago. And then she said, I tore my other Achilles 8 years ago, like 1 year after the other one. So if you start to hear that, right? So if you understand side effects of certain antibiotics on tendon tear. So I asked her, hey, what antibiotics did you take? And so Cipro. So known documented side effect to cause tremendous tendon problems. Because I actually joked with her. I was like, hey, do you play rugby? She's like, no. Because you don't just walk around and all of a sudden tear your Achilles. It's like the biggest, thickest tendon in your body. And so what's amazing was because she tore, and if you don't know anything about torn Achilles, if you're listening, it's like a pretty long recovery process. It's typically about a year before you feel normal. And so basically by the time she felt normal for one, she tore the other one. So like 2 years of not walking normally because you're in a cast and boot, and then it's a whole mess of walking. Obviously then her hip started to hurt and the back started to hurt. So because of the pain, they put her on, she's been on straight non-steroidal anti-inflammatories for years, like every day straight. And then that combined with repeated bouts of antibiotics, obviously like wrecks your stomach. And then that we now know has effects on your brain. So she started to feel, just say, not well and happy. So they put her on Lyrica, Wellbutrin, so a bunch of meds for her brain, which then rots your brain. And so I started, so I can see all her medication. It's like, yeah, I mean, I can see how this is all triggered from literally 10 years ago, antibiotics. And so, yeah, it's fascinating to see how deep the rabbit hole goes when you start to look at the side effects of medicine. Yeah. So, this is a great place. I'm gonna put something on the screen so people can see this. Right. So this is the interactive, section. So if you're watching this, if you're taking medications, what are you currently taking? Right. So you can just kind of chime in if you're watching right now. If you're currently taking any medications, it'd be fascinating for us to see what you're currently taking, because more than likely there might be better options in some of these medications. Right. Right. And so, and I'll give people to kind of chime in some time. If we move on to the next question, we'll kind of bounce back to this. So if someone wanted to do everything possible to avoid having an illness, what is the current gap between current medicine and the ideal solution? What is that gap?
Okay, so I'm a naturopathic medical doctor, and part of what we learn through our medical school is something called the therapeutic order. And what that means is you start with the most gentle, simple solutions, and then you move towards drugs and ultimately surgery, right? So unfortunately, what happens is nothing is done. There's a huge gap between the preventive side, which is obviously first, and immediately jumping to drugs and surgery, which is predominantly what happens. Now, usually if you go to the medical doctor with a metabolic problem, or you don't feel well, usually they recommend diet and lifestyle and exercise, right? That's usually true, but there's not a whole lot of guidance that's given. And a lot of times it's 30 years out of date. Or people aren't held accountable, or they're not guided, or they're not supported in this process. And so, yeah, that's great, diet and lifestyle, but I mean, the bottom of the food pyramid is something like 11 or 13 servings of carbohydrates, and working out 90 minutes a day, which of course you have to do to work up those carbohydrates. So it's just antiquated information. Now, there's also, so in between prevention and the drug piece, there's awesome stuff, because there's so many natural things that you can do in between. Okay. So, I mean, that's fantastic. And there's thousands of years of research even, in herbal medicines, as you can see with like ethnobotany and like medications that have been used in tribal peoples, etc., that are natural herbs, and even like minerals, functional foods. There's so much that can be done when you start to feel unwell in order to help support the system. So I think that's a big place. Plus, like the diagnostic testing of actually seeing what's going on, because really, I mean, we've talked about this before, the amount of testing that's done normally, it doesn't really tell you a whole lot except like anemia, blood cancer, you know, kidney disease, liver cell death, infections, and high cholesterol, which doesn't matter anyway. And so that's not a whole lot of depth of information. It's not talking about, you know, inflammation even, or, you know, where that inflammation is coming from, or looking at, you know, neurochemistry and how the brain is behaving, or your hormone levels even. And that's not necessarily seen as something that insurance wants to pay for whatever reason, I don't understand. But that's a huge gap. And so not only like the natural means of therapeutics and like how to address problems, but just finding stuff before it goes wrong. Like we don't really go in for a tune-up.
Yeah.
We don't. We just expect it to keep on going until something goes wrong and then take a pill.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like if someone were listening and they were like, you know, all right, so there's a problem with medicine and the typical tests are really just scratching the surface. And let's say someone's, we'll say asymptomatic, right? Like if we see a lot of people that they're like, oh, my blood work from my doctor, according to my cholesterol, my blood sugar, my liver enzymes, like the typical thing that they test for, everything is normal. What do you, based on your experience of treating massive amounts of people, like what other additional data do you recommend that's typically missing that can lead to diseases brewing that they don't know about? Okay,
so this is, and I've done a lot of different stuff, as you know. Like I'm very eclectic, and I like to dabble in, you know, like pro athletes to cancer to, you know, right now I'm doing a lot of research and education for myself and my patients on cardiovascular disease. Mm-hmm. Because heart attacks are still killing more Americans than anything else. Yeah. And it's a huge, I mean, and what is being done is completely ineffective.
Oh, yeah.
Completely ineffective. And 50 to 70% of people who die every year of a heart attack have no warning.
Yeah.
They have no warning. And so I run those tests to see, are you actually forming plaque? Do you have inflammation in your arteries? What do your lipids really look like? Because if like the number of your bad cholesterol or your LDLs means basically nothing. It's about the size and the shape. So if you've got small, dense ones, they're way more likely to get into the lining of the vessels and cause plaque. And so that, you know, likelihood of diabetes, right? I saw something, 86 million Americans are pre-diabetic.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
And they don't know because their blood sugar is normal. Mm-hmm. And you're not going to run hemoglobin A1C as a check, you know, just to check. It's more of, and we look at insulin, we run the hemoglobin A1C, we run glucose, and then we see what's the likelihood that you're going to develop this. Because sometimes people do need to be scared a little to make changes. You know, oh, my blood sugar's fine. Oh, my lipids are fine. Well, are they?
Yeah.
When we really go a little bit lower. And one of my other favorites, I think, is checking to see nutritional levels. Mm-hmm. Because we are made out of chemicals. Mm-hmm. And we function on how those chemicals interact. And so if you know what these functional levels are and optimize them, your body is so much better off. And that's like, it's not just vitamin D. Everybody's crazy about vitamin D in the last 5 years. And we've been talking about it for probably 20, right? So now we're like, vitamin D, great. Yeah. Yes, vitamin D. But there's so many more vitamins than just vitamin D.
Yeah.
And they're functional. They have incredible activities in the body that if you pay attention to, you can be able to like tweak and see. And they're a simple, safe, effective thing to do to solve that problem so that you don't progress to diseases that can cause terrible issues down the road.
Yeah, and just in case, I think, because I feel like a lot of patients, they don't obviously know how to read the blood work. Yeah, if you're watching, you may not know this, but when you get your physical, they're not testing for your vitamins and minerals. Yeah, because they can see all the numbers. They might just assume somewhere in there are all the vitamin and mineral amounts. They're not.
No.
Yeah, and I tell patients all the time, I'm like, we are millions of chemicals in our body, and every chemical is made. It's like it's like a soup with ingredients, and every ingredient is a vitamin and mineral, right? So it's like silly if you were a chef not to understand, okay, so what are all my ingredients that I have to work with when I need to make my carrot soup, right? And so that's basically, that's what's happening right now. Sure. So in the last, actually, how many years have you been practicing, and roughly, I don't know, how many patients have you seen?
Well, I've been practicing 12 years, and I've seen probably close to 10,000 patients.
Yeah. So that's such a great number because there's so much, I'm a huge fan of like data, right? So that's like a crap load of data. Yeah. So are there any general patterns that you've seen? And it's amazing, you've seen anything from pro athletes to, cancer patients, even with such a diverse population. Like, are there any patterns that you've seen with people that you feel like the masses need to be aware of?
Sleep.
Okay.
So I've always slept really, really well, right? I mean, and I guess something is to say, I have a friend that says, every snowflake, right? Every snowflake is an individual, right? But we're all snowflakes. And so there are things. I mean, and it's just simple stuff. I mean, most people are dehydrated. They're not getting enough water. Most people aren't sleeping well enough, or like the quality of food. The other piece that I pay a lot of attention to is toxicity. Okay. And that is something that is never looked at. And if it is looked at, it's looked at incorrectly. So if you, let's say, well, I was having neurological problems. I was getting paralysis. No one could understand what was going on. They ran my lead levels, and it was all normal. Well, if we actually run what looks at more of a functional lead assessment, which lead gets stored in your bones, lead gets stored in your fat, it gets stored in your brain. If you pull that out and kind of peek under the cover and see like what real levels are, it can be very different. Yeah. Very different. Because if you're not currently eating paint, your blood levels are not going to be high. But yet you could be having exposure from years ago that's stored around your nerves that's causing problems. Got it. So that's something like, and now we can run some really easy samples to see all of these organic chemicals, not even heavy metals, but like glyphosate. We've got a big lawsuit going on in California about it now causing non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And, it's a known it's a probable human carcinogen according to the World Health Organization. And I think it's the other like International Assessment of Potential Carcinogens or something like this. They know, right? And yet we don't know how much we're getting exposed to. And so we can test and we can see that. Like how much, are you a contractor? Have you been exposed to a lot of paint or carpets? Or, there was something else in California. We're kind of lucky here that they're paying more attention to the chemicals in the environment because of our Prop 65 and law. About new building recommendations to protect people from plastic pipes because they're seeing that these plastic pipes are leaching things into the water. They're allowing toxins from the ground source into the water. They're not as good as copper, right? And so we're starting to see this. How many plastics are you exposed to? Because plastics can short circuit your hormones and cause cancer. And so I would say that. I mean, besides like regular hygiene, basic, like eat well, sleep, drink water, you know, do your stress management, move your body, like the big things. I'm a nerd about testing because I love data. And so it's like the toxicity. You don't know. It's just sitting in there lurking until it goes, right? Like you have that straw that breaks the camel's back.
Yep.
And so that is something that I would recommend everyone do.
Yeah. So just so the listeners know, like because there's a lot of, there's so much about detoxing, right? I feel like, I guarantee you there's someone watching this that believes when you pee on a stick that tells you your pH and your pH is awesome. That's like, oh, I'm detox. Right. So what is like the definitive test to discern the toxins in your body?
Ooh, so there's really two.
Mm-hmm.
And they're both urine tests actually three. You can do like fat biopsies.
Okay.
Hair analysis, I'm not super crazy about because I don't think it's as accurate. It's more of a long-term exposure. And I don't think, like, I like to look at things kind of like time lapse, right? Rather than just one shot. And I think that it's more of a static view and it's not as functional as I like.
Yep.
So for like heavy metal toxicity, which is a big issue, and you need to like chelate to get stuff out. And that's when you get the real big bad guys like gadolinium. If you've had a lot of MRIs with contrast, you can have high levels of gadolinium, which is a heavy metal causing issues in your body all over the place. From our medical system and finding out, I mean, imaging is important, but if you store this stuff in your body.
Yeah.
So in that case, it's a urine test where you do a urine sample first to see what you're actually being exposed to kind of acutely every day or what you're moving out. And then you take a chelator and then you urinate in a container for 6 hours. And then you see, what do you have just everyday exposure versus what's hiding in there? And so then that kind of like sees what's hiding as far as the heavy metals, plus how well you're able to clear them. And it can change quite a bit because a lot of people have a lot of stuff, especially now as we're moving into like more toxic, like people in Texas especially, we get those things back, we're like, whew, from those refineries and things. But then the other organic compound test is another urine test. And there's a couple of labs that do it, but my favorite is done by Great Plains.
Okay.
And so they look at all kinds of different metabolites from chemicals like pesticides and plastics and even glyphosate from Roundup. And so that's probably my current favorites, but environmental medicine is such a new industry really that it's only going to get better.
Yeah. And, you know, for the listeners that don't realize this, so the stats are, since 1976, 82,000 chemicals have been added to our products, our environment, and less than 300 have any safety testing.
Right. Yeah. And they've never been tested together. So you've got 82,000 and the only safety testing are like, well, this causes hormone disruption, birth defects, you know, like crazy cancers and all of that. That's what they do alone. Yep. That's not even what they do with the other 81,999.
Yeah, for sure. There's zero testing on what happens if you dump a few dozen or a few hundred into a liquid vat of blood and what that does. Yeah. And so we talked about this in the other video and we'll share some of the stats, which is like, you know, recently when they tested like random people's blood, they found like 300 chemicals in our blood that don't belong there. Right. So if you're thinking, oh, you know, I live pretty non-toxic. No, on average, there's like 300 chemicals in our blood. Yeah. It's so hard to completely avoid. Probably the only way would be you just live in a cave inside a bubble.
But the bubble would be plastic.
Right. And the bubble has like an air purifier. Maybe.
Right. And it has to be glass.
Right. It's glass with an air purifier. That's probably the only way. And you've learned to meditate, so you don't need water and food, right? So you're like
you're an Eritrean.
Right. Exactly. That's probably the only way you're not going to have some chemicals. So I so agree how, you know, finding your toxic levels of these chemicals in your blood is huge. I mean, neuroinflammation, so many effects come from these metals and the organic compounds that we're we're, exposed to all the time. Yeah, it's huge.
And I think one of the big pieces too is we think that like there's something called the blood-brain barrier, right? That's supposed to protect the brain. And there's also something called like the gut barrier, right? And then there's the placenta. And those things are designed in our body to protect like inside from outside so that stuff can't get through. And I hate to break it to everybody, but with inflammation and with toxicity, they are no longer intact.
Yep.
And so it's a lot easier to pass. I mean, in 2005, babies were being born with 200 industrial chemicals in their umbilical cord blood crossing the placenta.
Yeah.
And the same thing with leaky gut, right? And then neuroinflammation.
Right. Yeah. So I try to go like super simple. I'm like, imagine there's holes in your intestines leaking out poop everywhere into your body.
I like that.
Right. It's super simple. Like, because they know like, oh yeah, I'm not supposed to have poop around my heart, in my blood.
That's a bad plan.
Yeah. Yeah. So it paints a very clear picture. I'm like, I mean, a very simple analogy of like what's happening inside.
Oh, it's good.
Yeah. Yeah. So, can you share an example of maybe a typical common illness, like a case study almost that you have treated in the past, and walk through? I think it'd be fascinating to walk through like what was the testing process, how are you able to figure out the root cause, and then what was like the process of getting those people well? The common diagnosis.
Like a common one?
Yeah.
Well, I think that so many people, and I do this just about every day, so many people have a combination of diabetes and heart disease. Okay? And so I think that's because cancer can be like really exciting to see, but I mean, that's something, that's different and it's doable, but I think that to be more applicable. So let's look at cardiovascular disease and diabetes. So we're going to look at whether statin drugs or the high cholesterol that you're on is actually changing the most dangerous component of the lipid picture, which is the small dense LDLs, because a lot of times they don't, or they raise them. And they don't, then we look at inflammation in the blood vessels, because diabetes and heart disease go hand in hand, because diabetes and high blood sugars are like broken glass going through your blood vessels, which then causes inflammation, which then causes plaque to be deposited. And so that's why they go together so significantly. And so if you look at the inflammation process, and not just like, okay, your inflammation is high. Great, that's still, we're not gonna just give anti-inflammatories. I mean, partly, sure, but where is it coming from? If it's not just diabetes, the diabetes and the high blood sugars. So something came out, I think about 2 weeks ago, showing that particulate matter, or the smoke particles in the air, make diabetes worse. Did you see that? Yeah. And it's so interesting to me, because you'd think, well, it's just because of diet, or it's just something people get, right? Like I've heard that, and it's not. I mean, there's this inflammatory piece that's made worse. And we also know that air pollution and like the smoke particles, these super small particles in the air, cause inflammation in the vessels and plaque, along with other like lung diseases. And so we test like, what's your air like? By looking at reports that you can get on the internet. How important is it for you to have an air filter? How important is it for you to have a water filter? What sort of industrial chemicals are just being put out into the environment in the area where you live? What are you eating? Like, do you have big exposures? So we check heavy metals, because chelation and the process of pulling heavy metals out of the body is actually FDA approved for plaque in the arteries. That interesting, right? And so, because we know, well, I guess it'll probably be unapproved soon, but who knows? I should knock on wood for that.
Right.
So we look at the whole picture. I want to see what your omega fatty acids look like, because those are anti-inflammatory. They're important for lipids. They're important for every single cell in the whole body. They're important for your brain. What are your nutritional deficiencies? And a good example of this is like, why is your blood sugar high? Is it because you just eat chips all day? Probably not, right? A lot of people are trying to be more conscious about what they're eating. So it's not just air pollution, obviously, either, but it's not just diet. Are you chromium deficient? Are you molybdenum or, vanadium deficient? Like, there are minerals that help your insulin receptors work better. And so that's a big piece of it as well. So we look at the nutritional piece, we look at the toxic piece, we actually look at the metabolic and how that's functioning. So, we can help people manage their symptoms while we can lower their need for these medications so that their body's actually just kind of like restarting. The body has an amazing ability to heal itself if you just give it what it needs and get out of its way, right?
Yep.
And so like that's a big piece. And the microbiome, I'm coming out as the huge nerd that I am, right? So the microbiome is another piece of medicine, like with vitamin D, where people are like, oh yeah, those good bacteria are really good for everything. Oh, they're good for everything, everything in your whole body. So we check that and we balance it. And then the other piece I think that's really interesting is that, because I do a lot of meditation, and I do a lot of like yoga and that spiritual piece, but there's times where that internal motivation, or like there's this underlying driving force of stress or anxiety that most people just get a Xanax for, or they just get an antidepressant for. And that, I think, is another big piece of like what conventional medicine is missing, because after you get your 6th round of antibiotics and you've decimated your microflora, if you still don't feel well, you must be crazy. So here's your antidepressants. And so actually, I think that there's sometimes if you can check what your neurotransmitter levels are and then balance them naturally by helping the body make them and recognize them better, then that makes everything better, because that makes you want to eat better for yourself. That makes you want to exercise. That helps you sleep better. And then there's the hormonal aspect, because so many of these chemicals shift hormones that if you can help the body have natural optimal levels of hormones, you're going to age better, you're going to feel better, the brain's going to be better, you're going to sleep better. So we just try to look at so many different things, because if you just concentrate on one, it's so much harder. It's like the spoke of a wheel, right? Like if you have like you're just pushing on one spoke, it's a lot harder to move than if you have a team pushing on, 8 or 10 of them.
Yeah, and I love how you touched on so many things. I'm getting a little echo. So many things, and it is this complex interaction of every system that you talked about, right? Everything. And it's so important to be able to look at it from all those angles, because one medicine doesn't do that. And I'm sure you can tell, like, even just you describing it all took like, I think like 10 minutes, let alone digging into every single one of them. I mean, that takes a lot of time, right? And so like we talked about in the beginning, where medicine, people are getting 15 minutes, maybe 30 minutes of a doctor's time. There just isn't, the system doesn't allow for this to happen. Even if the doctor knew of all this, which some of them may not, the system just doesn't allow like this type of analysis to happen. Yeah.
And then there's the genetic piece, right? Because we're starting to see like that, the genetic aspect of our bodies is it's fluid, and it can be changed and it can be optimized. And that is something that can't be done with drugs.
Yeah.
And so that's something that's going to be completely missed.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's just for some of the listeners may not know. So, when I was in high school, we were taught like nature versus nurture, like as if essentially like your genetics are set. If you have these genes, you have these genes, and then you have like, environmental stuff. That complete reality has been proven wrong, right? Like we know constantly our genes, like the analogy I use, like a gene is like a light switch, and we have millions and millions of light switches, but they're constantly being turned on and off depending upon our emotions, the Wi-Fi waves, the foods that we eat, the bacteria that's in our body, the air that we breathe. Yeah. So, it's interesting when you talk about particulate. I was looking at some interesting studies. Now, I was going to post this on Facebook. I didn't want to placebo people because I feel like sometimes, knowing this stuff may backfire. But there was a fascinating article on particulate matter concentration and like suicide rates. Fascinating. Yeah. Just because neuroinflammation, depression, right? So the cascade, it's just fascinating how we don't even pay attention to like, oh yeah, the air we breathe in is basically pulling in chemicals and stuff into our body. And that is a completely not talked about thing in medicine.
No.
Right? And you kind of touched upon some other things like, stress. That's the other aspect of medicine that really isn't discussed, which is behaviors. Like what is, your heart disease didn't come from like, you weren't in a car accident and you fell and hit your head and you're like, I have diabetes. Right? That's not how diabetes and heart disease starts. Right. So it came from life. People feel like, oh, it came from nowhere. I'm like, no, it came from your micro choices and decisions and decades of a certain behavior over time built up this illness, basically. And so it does take so much detective work to kind of figure out all those sort of micro elements that contribute to this recipe of diabetes and heart disease. Yeah. But don't you feel like, I feel extremely grateful that we have the science. That's the beauty, is like, we know, there are tools to detect in every which way. Everything we talked about can be measured, can be analyzed, and we can connect the dots. Like, it's not like we're sitting here saying you have XYZ disease and we don't know how to figure it out. Like, all the data is out there.
And I had a patient yesterday who I saw, she started a program with me 2 weeks ago. So she had her labs done before she was with me 2 weeks ago, with 2 weeks of eating differently. We haven't even gotten a whole lot of laboratory analysis back. Her cholesterol dropped 30 points. Her triglycerides dropped 50. And her blood sugars went down from about 130 fasted to 86 in 2 weeks. Without meds. And so, I mean, we see it all the time. And now that I have the lab work back, I'm going to be able to address all kinds of the other pieces. And she was doing pretty well. Like, she had just the beginnings of like pre-diabetes. They started to want to put her on metformin. And so we did the dietary piece. And then, we'll check in, we'll see like, how has your hemoglobin A1C changed? Like what's going on with insulin, et cetera. And so that was a great big win yesterday. She was super happy. And then a couple of others, like their allergies are gone yesterday, right? Like, I had a cough for about 10 years and I was taking Mucinex twice a day, and now it's gone. And I haven't taken a Mucinex in a week, and I'm fine even with all the smoke everywhere. And so it's amazing. Like, I regularly get people off of their blood pressure medication all the time, because we run that testing. There's herbals and nutraceuticals and support. Like, if you give the body these building blocks, then you need less of your medication. And there's kind of like a little, balance effect where we can give a natural thing, drop down the meds a little bit, until the body kind of catches up so that you can decrease the side effects. People often ask me, like, what are the side effects of what you do? Feeling better.
Right.
Feeling better and reversing disease.
Yeah, I feel like, great. So you kind of touched upon like, what is the process? So once we have all the data, right? So you touched upon like, maybe we start to decrease the meds and replace it with some of the natural forms. Like, let's talk, and we can take the diabetes, heart disease example. Like, what would be the common process? Like, what typical supplements might be recommended? What is the time frame for someone that may be currently on meds to get reduced and then eventually off of meds? What does that look like? Maybe walk through that. So
if people are on board to change how they eat and they move.
Yeah, we'll assume they're fully on board, like,
okay. Okay, good.
Magic wand.
motivated. Like, that's what I loved about the pro athletes is you're like, do this. They're like, got it. Yeah. And they did it. It was fantastic for the most part, right?
Yeah.
So common things, I've got a really fantastic blend of minerals and herbs for blood glucose support. And so with the dietary pieces, like metformin can absolutely be a thing of the past, right? And a lot of it is like chromium, cinnamon, jemima, like they're just natural substances that the body actually recognizes as food. And so it doesn't tax the liver and make it more of a problem or just something else the liver has to deal with as much because it's more gentle. And so that's something that I have people take before before meals. And so then we just see their weight shifts, their blood sugar shifts. And because we're addressing the cause, it's not something that you have to do forever. But I also like to take, dark-skinned berries and proanthocyanidins and what makes the blood vessels more strong so that they're not harmed as much by elevated blood sugars and they're able to repair, and like vitamin C for the collagen synthesis, and anti-inflammatories like turmeric are a fantastic thing, both for the liver, for the lipids, for the glucose management. I mean, it's good for about 150 different things in the body. Yeah. Not exaggeration, right? Yeah. And then the blood pressure, actually, I often see significant drops just by taking out what's inflammatory and helping people sleep. And then if they need a little bit more, then there's a couple. So most drugs were actually initially from a plant, right? Yeah. So the first blood pressure medication was reserpine, which comes from 𝑽𝒊𝒂𝒂𝒂, which it functions like a natural beta blocker. And so I use that instead because a lot of times, so what pharmacies do is they'll take this big plant that's got, hundreds of different chemicals in it, and they'll take one out and they'll super concentrate it. They'll change it a little bit and patent it, and then they'll see if it has those effects. It's like the same thing with Lovaasa, that fish oil, prescription fish oil that can give you flu-like symptoms, which I'm like, what did they do to that to make you feel that sick? Really? Regular fish oil doesn't do that. Right. So we give the full chemical components because you know what? They all work together. There's synergy there. And I think that's the coolest thing of what I think I do is the synergy of it all. Like, how does this help this, help this, help this, pull it all together and help people feel better? Yeah,
and I feel like for the listeners that may not fully understand what all that means, I usually just have them experience it, which is like take 200 milligrams of like caffeine anhydrous or drink like 2 cups of coffee. It feels completely different. Right? Same amount of caffeine, but there's a bunch of other stuff in coffee designed to balance it out. Right. Versus straight caffeine is a completely different feel. Right. Because nature balances it all. And when we try to mess with nature for profits, it may not always work the best way. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. Granted, I do want to say for the listeners that I'm not saying we're not saying all drugs are bad, right? We're just saying that the drugs are a tool. It's the way in which they're being used. It may not be the most serving of people's health, right? And so all right, so you're using the natural things, you're kind of figuring out the balance. Like, what is the time frame on average? Let's say if someone does have diabetes, what's that time?
If someone's on like 2,000 milligrams of metformin, which is kind of like a mid-grade dose, right? And that's all they're on, 3 months, or less. Will usually address the problem.
Is that just to clarify? Is that 3 months basically before they get off the drugs, right?
Yes.
Yep. Got it.
Yeah. And so, if it's more complicated, if you've maxed your dose of metformin, plus you're on glipizide max dose, plus now you're implementing insulin into the process, that's a lot more complicated because that means that we have to step back different meds. Okay. But In that case, usually like a 6-month chunk of time can get you down, like either off. Depends on how much weight you have to lose too.
Okay.
And so sometimes it's touchy, but a good 6 months can make a big, big dent.
Okay.
Like definitely off insulin.
Is it realistic to say, let's say someone, again, we have like magic wand, right? So we like Jedi mind trick the people and say, you will lose weight. And so they lose the weight and then they implement sort of this natural approach. Is it realistic and possible to say that after, let's say, a year, they can get 12 months, they can get off of those meds? Is that realistic?
Definitely.
Got it.
But I mean, it's interesting to look at all the different pieces too, because if you don't sleep, you're insulin resistant like any diabetic, right? And so if you're diabetic and you're not sleeping, then that makes it another huge piece. So we can give you, we can change your diet and we can, give you these natural drugs, right? Which we don't want to just do that. We don't want to just swap out, oh, well, this is a natural metformin. That's not what we want to do. We want to shift everything so that you don't even need it anymore. And if you're not sleeping, then you're not going to be able to really reset your metabolism. I think the favorite stories about that is like 𝗏𝒂𝒃𝒊𝒂𝒂, when he, bulked up to be Superman. He ate like 6,000 calories a day and he slept 12 hours a night and he worked out the rest of the time. But that sleep is how he got lean. That sleep is how he was that anabolic.
Yeah, sleep is huge. So, and we can sort of end with that topic, which is there are so many people I know in the entrepreneur space that because they're cranking out work and stuff and the stress, that they have difficulty either falling asleep or staying asleep.
Right.
What are some solutions to that? Like, what is that process? If someone has insomnia, is that treatable?
100%. I got stuff that'll put down a rhino, right? Because I practiced on NFL linebackers, right?
Got it.
Who have a pretty stressful job.
Sure.
And they're largely insulin resistant. Just headed for diabetes, right? Well, in a way, right? But
if it works for rhinos, it works for you. What's that process? I would love to hear this. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because there's something called sleep hygiene.
Okay.
So if you're on computers late, that's blue light telling your brain it's daytime.
Yeah.
So I have some really nerdy yellow lensed glasses that I wear at night to work. I actually got myself a sleep tracker recently because I really felt like I was getting good sleep and yet I wasn't feeling refreshed. And so I looked and guess what? I wasn't. I actually posted on my Facebook page about looking at unsupplemented sleep versus supplemented sleep. It's a remarkable difference as far as like the quality. And I really made a choice to concentrate on that. But it's really scary. And I love this. And I'm glad we came across to it because if you take a sleep medication like Ambien, Lunesta, Valium, Trazodone, alcohol, right, to drug your overactive brain that's like going like, I got to do this and this and this and this and this, and you can't get that to sleep. Yep. If you do any of those more than 17 times a year, your risk of cancer is the same as if you smoke cigarettes.
Wow.
Now, this blew everybody's minds in conventional medicine because they're like, wait a minute, it's not Ambien that's causing the cancer. It's not Lunesta that's causing the cancer. It's not the Benadryl that's causing it. It's not, what is it, right? Like it's going across drug classes. How can that be possible? And you and I know it's because those were covering up the underlying problem. Right? And so if you address that underlying problem, which is usually cortisol, it's usually cortisol. Like you're amped, you're thriving on endorphins and you're, more of like a person that likes stress, or you're active at night, or you're just working all the time and you've got this will that you're pushing yourself to achieve these fantastic things, and then you can't shut it off at night. Yeah. Well, there's a couple different stages that I have as far as like stepwise. Okay. And the first one is just like herbs and magnesium and that's probably going to help. But then the next step is, how do you drop those cortisol levels at night so your body knows that it should go to sleep? And there's a natural herb, magnolia, that does that. Melatonin also can be very helpful to reset that cycle and suppress that cortisol naturally. Magnesium is always good. The herbals are good, but helping your body make the neurotransmitters that help you sleep is awesome. But again, if you're not protecting yourself from the blue light and only keeping the bedroom for sleeping and sex, not like work and TV, and having screens not be on for about 2 hours and like wind down in other ways and do stress management and decompress, then again, it's just another thing that's covering up. It's kind of like a Band-Aid. It's a natural Band-Aid. But it's like Wellness Pro Thriver Sleep and a cortisol manager. And sometimes you have to take it to the next step. And then we can give pro hormones that help really settle down the brain's inflammation as well. But see, like if you take care of the inflammation, then the brain is often not so aggro as well. And so if these steps don't work, then there's always something else that can be done. You just take it to the next one and you see what's going on.
Got it. I love having multi-step process.
And I check neurotransmitters and cortisol too.
Got it. Yeah. So trying to figure out where this echo is coming from. So it's gotta love technology. So I feel like it's great that there's a multi-step process, and also like I love how it wasn't like super complicated, right? Like it was like really, really simple stuff that works. And we basically, to paraphrase what you were saying, we come up with the most broad, most common things and just kind of drill down. If that doesn't work, then you go a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper. Yeah. So I feel like sleep is huge. Yeah. So a couple of things. The Oura Ring is like the best sleep tracker out there. It's amazing. I don't wear it anymore because I had it for like 1.5 years. So I've like tracked my sleep data and tried all kinds of different supplements and so blue light blocking glasses for sure in certain supplements just makes a world of a difference. And it's interesting, actually since I had the ring for that year, it probably behaviorally cut my alcohol consumption down like by 80%. Because what I realized whenever 2 glasses of wine is like the most that I drink. So I'm not talking about like massive amounts, but even just 2 glasses of wine, like that night, my sleep was just awful. Right. Yeah. And then, so the Oura Ring sometimes has a sense of humor. The next day you can like interpret the data. And one time it said like, I hope you feel better than your sleep data. Like basically it was like mocking me, like my sleep data was horrible.
That's funny.
And it's interesting, like right before this call, I just posted something because I know a lot of friends are wearing the blue light blocking glasses, but because the commercial and the Facebook ads say to do it, they wear all day. And I'm like, well, exactly. Yeah, that face says it all. Like you don't want to be blocking blue light all day. It's the more is better mentality. So if you're listening and you have blue light blocking glasses, like 2 hours before bed, like we're supposed to have, blue light during the day. Yeah, that was a more is not better tip. So, so the last question we can end with is, we could never say to the public that there's like cures for diseases, right? That's obviously not a FDA approved legal term. However, I will say that, for those of the people that have been listening the whole time, you can start to see how if you find the root cause of things and you get rid of the root cause of things, let's just say your symptoms do pretty much go away, right? And so there might be listeners, like we're in this space, and so we just go, of course, right? So there might be listeners that are like, what are you talking about? If there were cures, if there was a way to stop my symptoms, wouldn't my doctor have told me? Wouldn't I have read this on Facebook already? Answer's no. Wouldn't I have like read this on a popular blog post? And so what's some some insight that we can give the listeners? So I'm a huge fan of like, if we can just change our thinking and our beliefs, everything downstream automatically like falls into place. And I feel like it is not mass media marketing and common knowledge for the masses where there's no like commercial that says, oh yeah, you could just stop all your symptoms by doing this. That's not it's the opposite, right? It's like, take this drug for this symptom. So what would be your advice? Like if someone were to come to you, essentially, like if you had a patient that was like, I don't believe you, right? Like, I don't think we can operate outside of this drug for this symptom approach. Like, what would you say to them? Yeah, like you basically, how would you like convince someone? Be like, no, this is the process. Like, how does that?
My mentor just wrote a book.
Okay.
And it's called Outside the Box Cancer Therapies.
Okay.
And I think that if you are worried about getting cancer, or if you know somebody that has cancer, which everybody does, right? You should read it. And my favorite part about it is at the end, there's over 1,100 references. Because he got tired of sending, people information to be like, well, there's no research on that. He was like, oh, okay. And so he like 1,100 references. And it's a book for the layperson. It's not even for practitioners. It's just, how do you prevent and treat cancer naturally?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one.
Yeah.
The other is Dr. Dale Bredesen.
Okay.
Did what his protocol, he wrote The End of Alzheimer's, which is the other big thing that we're worried about as we age, right? Huge. And you know what? Some people call it diabetes type 3.
I love that.
Headed, right? Yeah. And so he wrote a book, and he just reversed the signs of dementia in 6 patients in a UCLA study in 2016. Published research. Yeah. And so there's plenty of research out there. There's plenty of experiences. And I think that, I have a lot of patients that have done testimonials, just like, because it's kind of funny. Like, I can tell you this, and I can tell you the research, and I can say, well, physiologically and biochemically and, pathologically, and, there's, right? And people are like, yeah, who cares, right? But, if you experience it for yourself, mm-hmm. or you experience it in somebody else, that's so much more powerful. And like, I try to think, even if you could commit to, I don't know, we were just talking about sleep, going to bed at the same time every day, mm-hmm. how would you feel? Or if you could commit to actually eating as many vegetables as is recommended in a week, how would you feel?
Yeah.
And then take that, because I don't know, it's like the proof is in the pudding. Like, if you try it, you're going to feel better.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm too much of a nerd to be able to answer this well.
Well, I mean, I love some of your answers. Yeah, I mean, essentially your answers were, you could just do one tiny portion of essentially a non-medicine positive, healthy behavioral thing, and then you're gonna feel the benefits of that. Like baby steps, like you get the tiny win from the natural approach, and then you go, oh, this actually works.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the problem too is, like, people are like, well, I eat my gummy vitamins, or I take Centrum Silver and I never felt that much different.
Yeah.
It's like, well, there's also an element of quality.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And are you absorbing it?
Yeah.
And I think this is a good one. Do you know how much LeBron James spends on his body a year?
No.
$1.5 million.
Wow.
As we all should, right? Like, if you have the kind of money LeBron does.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you just get this to live in. This is all you get. And replacement parts are pretty hard to come by. Right?
Yeah. It's funny that you just brought that up. It's weird, actually, because 3 days ago, I just had a discussion with a patient. I was like, in my lifetime, I probably have spent like easily $100,000 on like nutrition and nutrition supplements. That's not like food. That's just like antioxidants and things like that. Easily 100,000. I was just thinking about that the other day. So yeah.
Easily. And I mean, just people tell me all the time, oh, because I teach a shopping class where I'm like, well, this is how you can shop at the grocery store. Mm-hmm. So that you can feed your body like this great food and like, make yourself out of good things. And they're like, oh, it's so expensive. I'm like, well, so is cancer.
Right.
I mean, so's dementia. So pain.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that I think I almost lost my leg in a car accident when I was very young. And I spent time bedridden thinking about everything I was going to do when I felt better. And, you know, really afraid that I wasn't going to be able to walk again, et cetera. And that gave me a tremendous appreciation for my body at a very young age so that I could take care of it and I could learn about how to optimize it. But then I was in pain for a lot of years after that as well. Mm-hmm. But when I almost lost my leg, that wasn't the time to eat more salad, right? Like that's when I needed surgery and that's when I needed medications, you know, that the other pieces came later. And now like I am largely out of pain from that accident because I pay attention to what triggers my inflammation. Yeah. And that was remarkable to me because I didn't think that I would get to that point. And I've experienced it. And one of my colleagues cured his Crohn's disease, right? By not eating McDonald's and managing his stress. And I mean, he'll always have the proponents, like the likelihood of getting it. Like if he gets out of balance, like that's the genetic aspect, right? Like, well, diabetes is genetic or that's genetic. Well, you have the propensity, you have the ability. If you get sick, that's where you'll go. Yeah. But we can rewind it and teach you how to not go that way.
Yep. For sure. Yeah. And you know, and I feel really blessed that in reflecting back on my like health journey, you know, it was like the shotgun approach like 20 plus years ago. You take like everything because you really like everything is awesome. And now I spend way less money on it because we test, we have better data. We can be like laser accurate in terms, I take way less supplements now than before because we know we have the data to go, oh, this is the best for me. And these are not the foods for me. So I just feel so much better with overall less monthly expense because of the better data. Yeah. It's amazing. Yeah. I mean, literally I used to take massive amounts of supplements and like, I probably take like 1/10 of what I used to take just because I know there's like, it's not the shotgun approach. It's like the laser approach. Yeah.
Like learning how to get stuff from food.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, it's funny. Like I'll try to get at least somewhere between 10 up to 20 servings of fruits and vegetables a day minimum. Right. Yeah. Because there's, you know, most people may not realize like our orange today is not the same as an orange 40 years ago.
8 of them.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So it's just not as nutritious. So yeah. And it's with that, whenever I lecture to the masses, I always do this like little survey, like raise your hand if you eat like, you know, 8 servings of fruits and vegetables versus 5 versus 3. The masses on average when I survey is 3 to 5. And it's like,
potatoes count?
What was that?
Do potatoes count?
No. No, luckily I haven't. That'd be scary if I actually asked that, right? So I probably should even clarify. But it's just the masses. Just everyone can benefit from more like organic, like fruits and vegetables for sure. Right. Yeah, great.
And that's why supplementation is important too, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of cool. In the last 20 years, I've seen definitely traditional doctors being much more open to herbal and supplements. I remember when I first started practicing, I still got none of that works. You pee it all out. Herbs definitely don't work. And for sure now there's this, because there's just so much more research, like hundreds of thousands of research articles have been out in the last 20 years, just kind of proving that, no, there's a lot you can do with supplements and herbs and stuff. So it's kind of cool. I feel like there is this shift where mainstream medicine is embracing like the natural stuff, which is awesome. Yeah. Cool. So I think we can leave off with that. And so again, this is a live recorded video, but we're going to go back. Like I typically will man the chat line, so to speak, the comments, and kind of see if there's any questions from people who weren't able to watch right now. And that, we can both do the same. And kind of, if you have any questions on this, all this information on how do you find the root causes of illness and remove those root causes, feel free to kind of chime in the comments. We'll kind of man the questions from there on out. Great. So thanks for being on this, Heather. I will we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.